Learn how to play Fabled The Spirit Lands. Come on back after the break. Hey everybody, welcome out to the show Board Game Reviews. This is a YouTube channel dedicated to our wonderful tabletop gaming hobby, and this video is part of a video series looking at Fabled The Spirit Lands. In this video I'm actually going to teach you how to play the game. If you just want a quick overview, want to see some sample gameplay, see my review of the game, or see the actual solo gameplay, because this game does actually have solo rules, check out the other videos in this series. Now this video I'm going to teach you how to play the game, and actually I would probably coach you before watching this tutorial video. This is one of those games I'd probably suggest checking out my actual playthrough video where I play the 2 to 5 player competitive version of the game. Not because the game is hard to explain. The game is actually super duper easy to explain how to play. Basically, the idea of the game is you're trying to get the most points by accumulating the most books of knowledge. The books of knowledge are used to do actions, but they're also used to get your victory points at the end of the game. On a player's turn, you're basically going to take 1 of 4 actions. The actions can be possibly gaining some books, adding cards to the spirit land to go and make the spirit land bigger, or you could just move one of your sages in the spirit land, or the final thing you do is actually convert some of these books into more powerful books, which is going to give you more victory points. After you've done that, you're going to pick some of the sages and some of the various different lands you're going to move. They may interact with some of the different locations. Then if there's any locations on the board, again, the board is made up of these cards, if there's any locations left on the board that don't currently have any sages on them, they're going to disappear into oblivion. That's going to go around for a certain amount of chapters based on player count. At the end of the game, we're added with the victory points, and that's going to be the winner of the game. The game truly is that simple to explain how to play. The trick with the game, though, is understanding why you do those actions, when you do the actions, and the strategies that are created from playing that way. So before you watch this video, I suggest you go in and check out my playthrough video, but if you want, stick around. I'm going to teach you how to play the full game of Fabled The Spirit Lands. Now, my YouTube channel is 100% sponsor-free. This means that for you, I'm not making you watch commercials, but for me, that means that everything you see on this channel comes out of my own pocketbook. You can help me with those costs. 2 seconds of your time, clicking the like button, clicking that subscribe button can help me keep those channel analytics from YouTube running strong in my favor and helping other people discover this channel. Or you just keep on doing what you're doing, support the other guys, make you watch their commercials, their sponsors, and their somewhat biased opinions. Let's go and get to the tutorial for Fabled The Spirit Lands. Now, before I take things any further, do understand this game does have a solo mode and a fully cooperative mode. I'm not going to cover that in this video. This video is going to be fully for the full competitive version of the game. I'm going to have another video where I'm actually going to play through the solo version of the rules and actually walk you through how to play that game. I think it's going to be a much better way to learn how to play the cooperative rules for the game, which again can be played solo or cooperative with your friends. So there's a certain amount of components that aren't even going to be used, and I got them all bagged up. We just need to remove them from the game because they're not going to be used at all in this tutorial. Next thing we need to do is make sure that we leave space in the center of the table right here, because we are going to line up these cards at these various different locations. The prairies, the mountains, and the forests, and these different locations are going to form the spirit land. This row will take anywhere from 7 to 12 cards depending on how many players you're playing and the strategies and the tactics you're using for the game. Now, there's a variant of the rulebook that tells you to handle it if you have a smaller table, and if your table is smaller, it does allow you to do certain things to accommodate that. I won't cover that because that's a simple paragraph on page 20 of the rules. Just give a quick read. It tells you how to take care of the problem if you have a smaller gaming table. After we've got this area set up for this nice open area where we're going to get all these spirit lands going on the board, now it's time to set up the board. And for the ease of simplicity, I'm going to explain to you that this game is actually a scenario-based game. The game does come with multiple different scenarios in it, and there's scenarios 0 all the way through scenario number 5. I'm going to teach you how to play the game with scenario number 0. Now, scenario number 0 is a easier scenario to help you understand the rules, and it's much more nice and easy. It does cover the vast majority of the rules, but there's a couple different changes that are included in the game when you play scenario number 0, and it just basically makes the game a little bit more of a learning game. My personal favorite way to play the game when I play the game is to play scenario number 2 and scenario number 3. Now, in my playthrough, I actually go ahead and use one of those scenarios that happen to be one of my favorite ones, and I do like them because I like how the different scoring works out and it creates a slightly different gameplay. But I'm not going to go through every single one of the scenarios and tell you how to set them up because it's going to create too much of a bog down on this video. Just understand that for this tutorial, I'm explaining how to use scenario number 0, which is referred to as Favor of the Gods, which is the introductory scenario, and it gets you a good feet into the door to explain how to play Fabled The Spirit Lands. First things first, we need to set up the time board. Now again, the time board, if you're only using scenario number 0, is going to be set up using scenario 0 right here in the scenario guide. If you happen to play anywhere of one of the scenarios 1 through 5, you're actually using the instructions right here on how to set up the time board. And just for demonstration purposes, I'm showing you what a time board would look like right now if you were playing with any one of the 1 through 5 scenarios. Going to flip things around really quick and show you exactly how we're going to set up using scenario number 0. The time board, when we're setting up for scenario number 0, is going to be based on exactly how many players we happen to be playing. If we're playing a 2-player game, we're going to put up these various different markers in these different specific chapters. That'll make sense when I talk about the chapters. We're playing a 3-player game, we're going to put the markers in those specific chapters. And if we're playing a 4 to 5-player game, we're going to put the markers in that those specific chapters right there. I have the board set up right now for a 2-player game, and basically what these different tokens do are going to be things that are going to happen during various different chapters. A chapter is basically a round of the game, and the game is going to play over a certain amount of rounds based on the amount of players. For example, a 2-player game is going to have 10 rounds, all the way up to a 4 to 5-player game, which we see is only going to have 8 rounds. Now the final round is actually played, so when we get the time tracker all the way to that final time round for the chapter, we do fully play that out. Then we're going to go ahead and play the epilogue, and epilogue is just a fancy way of scoring the game, and we're going to figure out who the winner of the game happens to be. So the game's set up here for a 2-player game. After we have it set up for a 2-player game, I'll explain what all these tokens do when we actually get to that point in the instructions. But just know that we got to put the time marker right here on the space right here, which does not have a number on it at all. We're going to advance that starting when we get past the prologue. Let's not worry about that quite yet, but there's just a couple different rules. Make sure you familiarize yourself with them when you're learning the rules of the game. They're going to be in the scenarios, and again, every one of the scenarios do offer a couple different rules to go ahead and modify how things play. Now, just to minimize confusing things, do understand that there are 3 event decks in the game. These 3 event decks are not used in scenario number 0. There's 4 cards for every single one of the event decks. 1, 2, 3 different event decks for a total of 12 event cards. Simply take these and remove them from the game because we're not going to play them or we're not going to use them during scenario number 0. Next up, we need to make sure that we shuffle every one of the individual location decks and shuffle every one of them separately. There's 3 different kind of locations in the game. We have the prairies, which we see is represented by more of the grasslands. We have the mountains, which is represented more with the mountainous terrain. And finally, we have the forest, which is going to be represented by the forest terrain that we have out there. After we shuffle every one of the individual decks separately, we're going to draw the top 2 cards and be displayed for all the players. Now, anytime when a player claims a location while we're playing the game, you're free to take one of the face-up locations or the top face-down location, which is going to be a blind draw. That works anytime we need to draw a location. I'm not going to repeat that throughout the video. At least hopefully I won't. I might, because sometimes I do stuff like that. But just understand that is a very solid rule in the game that anytime you're drawing one of the location cards, you can choose from one of the 2 face-up ones, or you can choose the face-down location card itself, which is basically most likely going to be a blind draw for you. Next up, we want to put all the different books of knowledge in a nice, easy, accessible location for all of our players. Understand that these books of knowledge are also matching the different planes and the different locations we have out there on the board. We have the books of knowledge representing the plains, which match the plains. We have the books of knowledge matching the mountains, which match the mountains. The forest, which you guessed it, match the forest, and the sun, which will matches nothing because the sun is generally our final victory points for the vast majority of our scenarios. Now, it's not going to be all of our scenarios, but most of the scenarios, our eventual goal is to get the sun books of knowledge, which are going to give us the victory points. In the basic scenario, those are the books we're trying to seek to become the grand winner of the game. Now, you're going to notice these books of knowledge are going to come in various values, anywhere from 1, 3, or 5. You are free to trade out like books at any time that you want. For example, if I happen to have a 1, and a 3 book in the plains in my personal supply, at any time this doesn't take an action, I'm free to take all these books, trade them in, and go ahead and claim a 5 book. You may want to do that to go ahead and control the amount of resources that are available in the game. And let's go ahead and cover the resources right now because this is very important. The books of knowledge themselves are an infinite supply. If you run out of any one of the books, go ahead and use whatever token you want to use to go ahead and replace them. I haven't had this happen too much. Once in a while in a 5-player game, we have to do a little bit of juggling of the resources, but generally speaking, in the 1 through 4 players, that very rarely happens, but it could happen depending on how your players are playing the game. So this is an infinite supply. The cards, the time, and the rest of the tokens themselves are a finite supply. Once they are exhausted, they are removed from the game. That does go for location cards. When a location card is removed from the spirit land, you're not going to put it back in a draw pile. It's actually removed from the game. Next up, we need to figure out who the first player is. Well, the rules tell us that the first player is going to be the person who most recently read a printed book. I imagine in about 10 years, we're going to have to find a different way to figure out who the first player is because I don't know about you, but I got a Kindle. That's how I do all my book reading, which basically means I never get to go first in this game. But that's okay. The game does have ways to balance that, and we're going to cover that in just a second. After we figure out who the first player is going to pick their favorite color and grab 7 sages of their color. There's 5 different colors of sages because this game does play up to 5 players. You're going to claim all 7 of those sages, plus you're going to gain 2 reference cards. One of them is a double-sided that explains how the game is played and the flow of the game. The other one's going to be a double-sided one that does explain how all the fabled locations and all the fabled places works. Do note, at the back of the rulebook, there is a nice overview which goes over all these different fabled locations and a little bit more words. You'll see that this is a little bit simplified. So if you have any questions and the card is just not quite describing it well enough for you, go ahead and check the back of the rulebook. And additionally, there's also various different sections in the back of the rulebook that also breaks down the allies and the specific different fabled places. You shouldn't have any questions. I personally did it, but if you have any questions, go and leave some comments down below. I'll do my best to help you if you have any rules questions at all. After players pick their 7 sages, their 2 reference cards, their players are going to gain 2 books of prairies, 1 book of the mountains, 1 book of the forest, and that's what we're going to do if we have a 2-player game. If we're having a 3 to a 5-player game, all additional players, starting with the 3rd player, the 3rd player is going to get 1 additional book of prairies. If we're playing a 4-player game, the 4th player is going to get 1 additional book of the prairies. And then finally, if we're getting a 5th player or a 5-player game, the 5th player is going to get 2 additional books of prairies, meaning that they're going to get a total of 4 books of the prairies. Additionally, if we're also playing a 5-player game, all the players must remove 1 of their sages from the game, because in a 5-player game, all the players only get 6 sages. And the final thing we need to do for the setup is every single player needs to get their starting ally. Now again, at the beginning of the video, I said I'm going to explain how to play the game with scenario number 0. So to do scenario number 0, the first thing we need to do is go through the ally deck and find the 8 allies that have the forest symbol right here in the center of the card. Find all 8 of those allies, remove them from the ally deck itself. After you remove the 8 forest allies from the ally deck, you simply shuffle up the ally deck, and every single player is going to get 3 ally cards. Every single player is free to look at their 3 ally cards, and they're going to pick 1 ally card to keep, and the other ally cards are going to be discarded to the discard pile. After every single player has done so, we're going to find out if there's any specific tokens that happen to go along with that specific ally by going through all the ally tokens that are available. If you have any questions, again, that is going to be covered in the rulebook, which goes over all the specific allies. If all the players have their ally and any tokens they may need to have, we're going to take the discarded ally cards, shuffle them back into the ally deck, and the ally deck is all going to be shuffled up, placed over to the side, because we are going to need access to the ally deck depending on certain events that happen on the time board. That's the full setup for the game. Let's go and explain exactly what we're doing, why we're doing things, and head to the prologue. But before we explain the prologue, let's go and explain exactly how these location cards work, how we're going to form the Spirit Lands, why we're walking through it, and oh yeah, how we're going to win the game. For the very basic scenario, scenario number 0, players are competing to see who can have, at the end of the game, the most books of the sun. There's a tie between the players. Whoever has the most books of the sun, the tiebreaker is going to be the books of the forest. There's still a tie, the tiebreaker is going to be the books of the mountains. If there's still a tie, the tiebreaker is going to be the books of the prairies. If at this point there is still a tie, the tie players share in the glory of generating the final great new universe that all of our great sages are competing for, which is the theme for the game itself. Now, this is how we're going to play scenario number 0. I want to emphasize some of the other scenarios actually change to different victory conditions. Make sure you check out the scenario book so you don't make any mistakes. Now, all these different books of knowledge and all these different locations, they all represent different elements. We have the plains, the mountains, the forest, and the sun. And again, when it comes to locations, we have the prairies, the mountains, and the forest. The thing you need to understand about the game is that this is more like a tier or a hierarchy. 2 plains can be converted into 1 mountain. 2 mountains can be converted into 1 forest. 2 forests can be converted into, yes, you guessed it, 1 sun. So the objective of the game is the players are going to be trying to visit different locations, take different actions in an effort to create conversions. These conversions will allow us to upgrade our basic books of different knowledge until we finally get to the books of the sun. Here's the trick and the challenge of the game, though. To enter the Spirit Land and to make the Spirit Land bigger, you must spend your books of knowledge. To bring a prairie into play, it takes books of prairies. To bring a mountain into play, it takes books of mountains. To bring a forest into play, it takes books of forest. Additionally, that's just the cost in the prologue. Once we actually get into the chapters, the lands become much more expensive depending on how the land is building out. With various certain lands becoming dominant, those lands will start becoming more expensive to put into play. I'll explain how all that works when we get to the chapters, just trying to give you a basic overflow of the game. Now, the basic idea of the game is we are sages traveling throughout the Spirit Land, visiting different locations. Anytime a player takes a location from the location decks and adds it to the Spirit Land, first things first, we must immediately replace that card. Location cards in the Spirit Lands, the location locations, are always immediately replaced. That does two things. One, it lets the other players in player order start planning out their turns. It keeps the turns going pretty snappy and quick. Additionally, there may be some effects that may reference that, so make sure you fill in those spaces immediately when you take them. Additionally, the hierarchy in the tiers of these different locations also references the power of them. For example, prairies don't give you as many powerful locations as mountains. Mountains don't give you as many powerful locations as the forest. So again, there's a hierarchy going on here. So the more expensive lands to bring out also have a tendency to give you access to better rewards. So that's a give and take you need to understand when you're playing the game of Fabled The Spirit Lands. Now additionally, anytime we're adding a different card or a different location to the Spirit Land itself, we can place it in the Spirit Land any way we want, evolving the Spirit Land in various different methods. And I'll explain the tactics and strategies of why we want to do that during the chapters. Just bear with me just a moment so you get the basics of why we're doing the things we're doing. So anytime a player adds a location to the Spirit Land, they are free to take that location card, always replace it immediately for the other players in player order, pay the cost of bringing that land into play, and then you can add that card into the Spirit Land any single way that you want. There's different strategies, different tactics, and different reasons why you'd want to do so, but adding these locations to the Spirit Land is what allows the Spirit Land to grow. So anytime you take a location, and again, you're free to take any one of the two face-up ones, or blind draw from the face-down ones, but anytime you add a location, you would add it to the far left, to the far right, or you can even break up the Spirit Land and add the new location in between the various different locations. Now, there's different reasons why you'd want to do so. There's a little bit of blocking going on. There's also different strategic reasons because you may want to create a solid path. Because if you look at every one of these cards, you're going to notice that there's a solid path on these cards that starts with number 1 and it counts all the way up and creates a path that's either going to start at the top or start at the bottom of the card, and it's going to end either at the top or it's going to end at the bottom of the card. If we manage to keep and create a solid path, our sages can continue along the paths into the next cards. The only time a sage is going to be removed from one of these location cards is if they get to the end of a card and there's either no location card in the next location itself, or if they happen to be on a path that dead ends and does not intersect and connect to the next card. So for example, we see this mountain right here. The path starts at the top of the card and ends at the top of the card, where this prairie, the location starts with the path on the bottom and the path ends at the top. So this mountain does not connect to this prairie, so this sage is forced to move off the mountain and onto that prairie card. It can't, and it's going to simply be returned to its owner's supply. Whereas we oppose if we have this prairie card right here, if we move all the way along this path right here, and we are allowed to move again, we're going to move onto this forest space because it continues the path into the Spirit Land itself. Now, the interesting thing is when you add a path, you don't need to make the path continue. You can make the path break up, or you make the path continue. That's part of the strategy. That's actually part of the tactical way you're going to be playing the game. The basic idea of the game is you want to play these paths in a way that's most advantageous to you, while being as detrimental to the other players as possible. Because anytime you add a location to the Spirit Path, you're going to take one of your sages and place it on every single path that happens to be on that specific card. Now, that's actually part of the cost, and it's actually part of the requirement. You have to have the amount of sages in your reserves to add that location onto the board, and then you have to place your sages out there when you add that location on the board. Now, prairies always only have one path. Forests always only have one path. Mountains always have two paths. One path, which is going to be a circular path, which is continuous, and then there's going to be a hexagonal path, which always dead ends. Ignore how the art is laid out. Always understand the hexagonal paths. Once you reach the end of it, doesn't matter what the next card looks like in the order, the hexagonal paths always dead end. Once you get to the end and you need to move again, you're going to simply return to that player's reserve. But the regular paths, the circular paths, will continue and can connect to other different locations. If you happen to have a location that continues the path, and then you continue from that circular path onto the next circular path. And if you ever forget, they use different symbols to make it nice and easy so you never forget. Circular paths continue, possibly. Hexagonal paths always dead end, it doesn't matter. Now the players, when they're adding out these locations and adding their sages onto the board, eventually are going to take move actions. Now we may take these move actions during a early part of our turn, or actually during the move part of our turn, we may take those move actions. And the basic idea is we are going to move our sages along these paths using move actions until we get to a space, which is going to be a landmark space. Landmark spaces have a slightly different symbol underneath them, and they're also going to have a dotted path which leads to a fabled location. Anytime one of our sages enters a landmark space, we must immediately, the moment we enter a landmark space, we are required to make a decision. We have to either A, immediately move in and visit that fabled location, and whenever you visit a fabled location, you have to interact with it, and you have to do what that location says, or do the backup action that's available to every single one of these fabled locations. I'll cover all that when we talk about chapters. But you have to make that decision immediately. If you decide that you don't want to visit that fabled place at that immediate time, either because you don't have the resources to take advantage of it, or you're trying to juggle your resources in a different format or factor, you can't visit that location on a later turn. You make that decision immediately when you arrive at that landmark space. If you decide not to visit there, that sage cannot visit there on a later round, even if they don't move. That choice is immediate. Do so or move on. So the basic of all these cards in the spirit realms is they either have a neutral space, which means they're not connected to anything, or they have a landmark space, which is connected to either one or two fabled locations. If a location happens to have two different fabled locations, you must decide which fabled location you want to visit. And the dotted path reminds you of that fact, and that decision is pretty much what you have to stick with. And you can't visit the other location, at least not with that sage. Now, somehow you manage to get two connected paths that form a solid path, and you manage to get to the other card. Your other sage can also eventually go to that path and visit the same location, or even visit the other fabled location. Just understand that one sage specific on that path can only visit the one fabled location that you choose to visit. Now, the good thing about visiting these fabled places is they don't require any extra movement at all. But if you have movement remaining when you visit a fabled place, you're going to lose any excess movement that you have available. For example, on your turn, if you took 3 points of movement and your sage happens to be at this location, you can move one space and then decide to visit that fabled location, and you're going to lose those last 2 points of movement. Or you can decide not to visit a fabled location, and since I had 3 points of movement, I can continue my movement, since the path continues, to go here and then go here. Now, the very cool thing here about this is that sages don't block each other. Each location, neutral or landmark space, can have an unlimited amount of sages on it, so there's no block in that aspect. All the blocking occurs in how you're building up the spirit land to block the other players. Now, the way we're going to resolve every one of these fabled locations is pretty darn easy. During the movement, we'll explain that when we get to chapters. Understand we're going to move into these different various fabled places, and multiple players may move multiple sages onto multiple different fabled places during that time. We'll explain that when we get there. But when we're resolving all these fabled places, it's very, very easy. Every single player is going to resolve all of their fabled locations for their own sages in any order they want for their own personal sages. If there's ever a moment where the turn order matters, we're going to resolve them in player order, and there are some locations where that might matter. So do pay attention to that, and if you happen to be in one of those locations, make sure you speak up quickly, because that may matter for the various different strategies for the game. But the very easy way we're going to resolve these fabled locations is you simply take your sage, remove them from the fabled location, return them to the landmark space that led to that fabled location, and then gain the reward that's specific to that exact fabled location. Now again, there is the reference card right here that is double-sided, explains what all the different fabled places give you, and you are required to go ahead and take at least part of the reward for the fabled location. Now, you don't have to take the entire reward. You can take part of it, but you have to take at least a little bit of the reward. If you refuse to take any of the reward itself, you are considered to be taking a substitution. Now, taking a substitution at a fabled location is basically an action that's available at all of the various different fabled places. But understand, taking the substitution is not visiting that specific fabled location. It's going to be very important when it comes to ally cards. For example, you may have an ally card that says, anytime you visit a terrain portal, something happens. So that means when you visit that terrain portal, you must take at least part of that action. If you refuse to take any part of that action, you will take a substitution, which means that ally's power is not going to trigger because you effectively didn't visit that exact power of that specific location. So that's where the wording and the powers and the abilities of all these allies and all the sages and all the different actions we're going to take are going to come into play. Now, like I said earlier, the main goal of the game is to do conversions and transmutations. Now, don't get confused. A transmutation is basically a slightly more powerful version of a conversion. It's all explained on the back of the rulebook if you have any questions about that. But the basic idea is to perform conversions to convert the various different books of wisdom into different tiers of books. Now, anytime you do a conversion, you can convert one tier into either up one tier or down one tier. What exactly does that mean? Well, that means that if I have one conversion, I can take 2 of my books of the prairies, discard them, and gain 1 book of wisdom for the books of the mountains. Now, that's one conversion. Now, if I want to take all of these books of prairies and convert them up as high as I possibly could, as an example, just to show you how this would look just like this. If I want to get these books converted up as high as possible, for one conversion, I can take 2 prairies, discard them to gain 1 mountain. If I had one more conversion, I can take 2 of these books of the mountains and convert them into 1 book of the forest. That's my second conversion. And then I could do a third conversion and take these 2 books of the forest and convert them into 1 book of the sun. That would take 3 total conversions, and conversions can go in either way. If I have these wonderful victory points, and now I need these victory points to bring out more locations into the Spirit Land, I can do a conversion in reverse order, but again, every step, every tier is 1 conversion that takes. I can discard this 1 book of the sun and gain 2 books of the forest for 1 conversion, discard 1 book of forest to gain 2 books of the mountains for another conversion, and again, discard 1 book of the mountains to gain 2 books of the prairies, and that would be a third conversion. It's very important to make sure you have enough resources to get these different locations out there, because I can guarantee you, if you're not getting your sages out there and visiting the various books and the various fabled places across the board, you're not going to win the game. So the challenge and the act of the game and the strategy is in juggling your resources, visiting different locations, trying to block off the other players, make sure they're not getting a nice solid path of plenty of resources to get the most books of the sun and win the game. Now, the game of Fabled The Spirit Lands is going to play out over 3 phases. The first phase is the prologue. You can basically think of it as an interactive setup for the game after the original setup of all the different resources are given to our different players. After the prologue, we're going to move into the chapters. Think of the chapters as the rounds of the game. There's going to be a certain amount of chapters based on the player count, generally anywhere from 8 to 10 chapters or 8 to 10 rounds of the game. The final phase of the game is going to be called the epilogue. Now, the epilogue, that's a fancy way of saying add up your points and find a winner of the game. So the basic thing we need to do right now is we need to explain how we're going to do the prologue. Now, the prologue is fairly quick, and we're going to do this in player order. And starting with player number 1, what we need to do is we need to start developing the board. The very first thing we need to do as player number 1 during the prologue, and again, don't advance the time marker yet because that's going to happen during the chapters. But the very first thing we're going to do is starting with player number 1 is they're simply going to look at the available different locations on the board. We're going to pick 1 location, and we're going to discard a book of knowledge that matches the location we want to put into the board. Now, fortunately, all of us start with 3 different books, meaning that we have access to all 3 of the lands. Various different strategic reasons why you may want to pick 1 specific land, but let's just go ahead and make this nice and quick. Let's say player number 1 wants to pick 1 forest, discard it, and we don't like any of those face-up ones, so we will draw the top one, add it onto the spirit realm, again, nice in the center, because these are going to be shuffling left and right quite a bit during the game. Take 1 of our sages, add it to the very first space of the Spirit Land trail, and again, they will start their journey into the Spirit Land. Next up, after player number 1 does that, player number 2 gets the option of doing the exact same thing, and I say option, but it's actually required. They must discard 1 of the books of wisdom and go ahead and pick 1 of the lands available and add it into the Spirit Realm. Now, like I said earlier, whenever we add a new location in the Spirit Realm, we can put it on 1 of the sides, or if there happens to be multiple locations already out, we can break it apart and separate it, and the various different reasons and various different strategies on why we may want to do that. The red player has decided that they actually want to complete a continuous Spirit Realm traveling, meaning that they're going to start right here, and since these 2 locations now connect, they've created a continuous path which allows them to go into the forest. Why have we done this? Well, we've allowed the orange player to add a forest into the land, and we're going to take advantage of it without having to pay 1 of our resources. Strategy and tactics. Anytime you add a mountain, the mountains are the only locations where you're required to add 2 sages, 1 onto the standard path, and then 1 onto the dead end path. All sages always start on space number 1 on the path whenever they add a new location. Now, there's only one caveat to understand during the prologue. During the prologue, ally powers are not in effect. You effectively might as well just keep your allies face down so you don't make a mistake. Allies have 0 power, and you cannot use any of the powers or abilities until we get to the chapter section of the phase. And we've covered the prologue. So let's go ahead and cover the chapters, which is the main actions and how we're going to take our actions. Now, at the start of every single chapter, we need to do a couple things, which is going to be a little bit of maintenance and a little bit of upkeep. And this is going to be controlled by player number 1. The very first thing that player number 1 needs to do is advance the time marker 1 space. If the time marker ever gets to the same location that we happen to have for the epilogue token, which happens to be right here, that's a signifier for all the other players that this is going to be the final round of the game. Now, don't forget, you do play the final round of the game, but once the time marker gets there, that's a signifier for all the players that this is going to be the final round of the game. So the first thing we do as a starting player is we'll advance the time marker. Next thing we'll do is we'll look to see if the time marker happens to be on a location that happens to match any one of these different tokens. Now, all these different tokens have various different effects, various different things. Some of them are going to be specific to scenarios. For example, these tokens right here are used in scenario number 0, but not in some of the other scenarios. Now, it's used in one of the other scenarios, but not in all of them. And some of these different tokens are going to have various different effects. The way these tokens were laid out was based on the setup and also based on the player count for the game that we happen to be playing. So when we advance the time marker, we'll simply look to see if any of these tokens happen with that location. If there's no token, we're going to have a standard round. If there does happen to be a token, we need to do one of various different actions. And if there happens to be multiple tokens at a location, we need to resolve these tokens in a very specific order, and that order is always constant every time we play the game. So if we advance to one of these locations, the first thing we need to do is look for that token. Now, if that token is a new event token, we are simply going to reveal a new event, and that event is now going to be in play. Now, events don't work in scenario number 0. I just want to cover them so you understand exactly how they work. Now, every one of these event cards is going to have a number of feathers on it. The amount of feathers is going to affect what event is actually going to be in play. If we are on the event that matches for a single feather, we will pick the event that matches a single feather. If we happen to reach an event location that happens to have 2 feathers on it, we will match the 2 feather event. If we happen to get to a location that happens to have all 3 feathers on it, for example, if we were at this space right here with all 3 feathers, then we would get the event down here that would match all 3 of the feathers. Again, that's not going to happen in scenario number 0. Just want to explain how that works and show you exactly how events happen, because events are the very first thing that will happen if we have multiple different tokens out there. The next thing we may have to interact with are going to be milestone tokens. Now, milestone tokens are specifically explained in the scenario. For example, scenario number 0 tells you what happens the first time you hit a milestone and the second time you hit a milestone. Go ahead and look in the scenario book, and it'll cover exactly what you need to do. The next token we might have is going to be a new ally token. Now, there's 2 versions of the new ally token. There's one which is only a new ally, and there's one that's going to be a choice. We'll cover the new ally token first because that's actually one that will activate first, especially if you have in a situation that happens to look like this. We'll activate the new ally first, and then we'll activate this one, and I'll explain how that one works in just a moment, but let's cover the new ally first. Anytime we get a new ally, we are simply going to take all of the different ally cards in the game. Just like the normal setup, every single player is going to gain 3 ally cards. Every player looks at all 3 of their ally cards, picks one to keep, and the other allies are going to be discarded. Now, occasionally in a 5-player game, you may see that you are running out of allies in the later rounds of the game. If you see that the deck is starting to look very, very thin and you think that might happen, make sure the players are handling this 1 player at a time. Simply give a player 3 cards, let them look at it, discard the 2, reshuffle the deck, and then go to the next player who gets to pick 3 cards, look at them, keep 1, discard 2, reshuffle the deck. Keep doing that, and that just ensures that every single player does get a variety of allies that they get to choose from. Again, that generally only happens in a 5-player game. I've never seen it happen in a 4-player game, but I guess it potentially could happen. I've just never seen it happen. The final token that we may have that we may need to resolve is going to be the new power and or new ally token. And this token is right over here, and that simply signifies that we are going to get a choice. We may either choose to unlock the second most powerful power on our ally card, or we may go ahead and decide that we will take 3 new allies, choose 1, and discard the other 2. The trick here is no player can ever have more than 3 allies in the game. So if you already have 3 allies, you are mandatory must choose a new ally or an ally you already have to go ahead and take the upgraded power. And that way we signify that we've upgraded our ally into the more powerful versions. We simply take the shamrock, Place a shamrock down. It lets us know that we've unlocked the more powerful power for that specific ally, and that power is now unlocked for the rest of the game. Now, the cool thing, though, is that this is a choice for every single player, and every single player gets to make that choice individually. They may either take another ally up to a maximum of 3, or unlock a power for one of the allies that they already control. Now, there's different strategies, different tactics, and different reasons. While you may want to do one or the other, a lot of the good strategy and the tactics of the game is the synergy of all your allies based with all the different locations that you want to visit and look at all the lands that are coming into play. Now, after advancing the time marker and seeing if there's any events that are going to occur for our current chapter, then we get to move over to the actual player phase, where in player order, every single player is going to take 2 different actions. Action 1 is broken down into 4 different choices. Action 2 is a mandatory choice, which involves interacting with the spirit land. And the third action isn't really an action or a choice. It's basically just a little bit of cleanup. So let's go ahead and explain exactly how this is going to work. On a player's turn, the player on their turn, when their turn comes around, they need to look at the 4 available actions that are available to them. And if you ever forget what the actual actions are available to all of our players, you can look over here on your player reference card, which breaks down the 4 different actions that are available to every single one of our players. The first action we can do if we want, and again, we must choose one of the 4, and again, we pick any one of the 4 we like. But the very first action we can do is we decide to take 2 Books of the Prairies. That's our action. We do nothing else when it comes to the action. We're going to move on to phase number 2 of this round for ourselves during this chapter. Only and simply just take 2 prairie cards, add them, 2 prairie books of knowledge, add them into your supply. That's basically all you're going to do. The next action you can take, if you want to, is you can go ahead and decide that you are going to perform 1 or 2 conversions. Now, explain how conversions worked earlier. You basically take 2 of one book and upgrade into 1 of the next level, or take 1 of one level and discard it and lower it down into 2 into 1 or 2 of the lower tier. 1 mountain becomes 2 prairies, 2 prairies becomes 1 mountain. And again, that's 1 conversion. You can do up to 2 of them if you like, if you choose to do that as your action. The next thing you can do is you can pick 1 of your sages that are currently in the spirit land and simply advance them 1 space forward. Now, if this advancing them happens to allow them to gain access to a landmark space, and they are on that landmark space now, you may immediately choose to go ahead and visit the spirit land. And the standard way you visit the spirit land, and we're about to explain how that works in just a couple moments here when we talk about movement, but you visit the spirit land, you're going to take advantage of that location, move back to the landmark, and that's simply what you're going to do for part of your movement. Again, that could be part of your strategies. The final action you may choose to do of the 4 actions that are available to you is you can go ahead and build up on the spirit land. Now, this is where the cost of the spirit lands are going to start skyrocketing very, very quickly. The cost to add a location in the spirit land is going to be 1 book of the specific land you're adding, plus 1 prairie book for each land type of that type that already exists in the spirit land. So, for example, if I, as a player, want to add another mountain by picking one of these mountains, it's going to cost me 1 mountain, which is a standard cost for adding 1 mountain into play, plus 1 prairie book because there's already 1 prairie book in play. Once I do so, I simply add the location anywhere I want on the end, or I can break it up if I like. I must have enough sages to fill in that location. So that does mean that if I only have 1 sage left, I can't pick a mountain. You're not allowed to. You must have sages in your reserve to go ahead and add them to the location. Don't forget to replenish the deck of available location cards, and then pay the cost equal to 1 of that land type plus 1 prairie book for every other land type that happens to exist. So if we come back to the orange player and we have the board that looks like this, and they want to add another mountain onto the board for some reason, it's now going to cost them 1 mountain plus 2 prairies because there's already 2 prairies in play. So you start seeing that adding multiple locations of the same type starts getting very, very expensive. So you want to use variety, use conversions to make sure you have the resources to keep putting these locations out into the board, because adding these locations are going to add the fabled locations, which are going to give you the resources that you need to win the game. After you've selected your 1 of 4 different actions, you're now done with your action part of your phase, and now we get to move to the movement phase. During the movement phase, you, on your turn, are going to announce 1 land type. The land types, again, are prairie, mountains, and forests. And all sages out of all the players on that 1 specific land type are going to move. The amount of movement that's going to be available to them, though, is going to be based on whether it's their player turn or it's not. If it is your player turn and you announce all of your sages on all those land types are going to move 2 spaces, and all the other players will move one space immediately. And remember, if you move into a landmark space, you must immediately at that point decide to access and visit that fabled place. If you decide that you don't want to, you don't have access to that fabled place, and you can't access it with that sage. You must make that choice immediately. So for example, if it's Red's turn and they announce mountains, all other sages will move 2 spaces on the mountains. And since we reached the end of the trail there, they would be removed since that's a dead end, and they've come back into their supply. If it is not your active turn, your sages are simply only going to move 1 space on the board. Again, if you go to the end of the card, you'll go to the next land. If the path continues, the path doesn't continue, you are returned immediately to your supply. And then what you must do is, if you're on a landmark space, you must immediately decide to visit it. If you do, you simply move your sage onto the fabled place. And then once all the movement is done, all the players in order will go ahead and resolve all their sages in their fabled places by simply pulling them off the fabled place, back onto the landmark space, and taking the action of that specific fabled location. And again, if you forget what all the fabled locations do, you do have this nice reference card and the back of the rule book, which goes over all of those various different fabled locations. If after the movement phase there happens to be a land space that does not have any sages on it anymore due to various different movements or various different actions, that specific location is going to go into oblivion. And oblivion literally because it's removed from the game. They don't go into a discard pile. Once the location card is removed, it is removed from the game, and we're simply going to move the decks closer together to continue and make sure that Spirit Land is one continuous path at all times. And again, this can change the way the paths are lining up, because now you see that we actually have one continuous path all the way from here, going into all 3 of these mountains and coming out all the way over here, which again can affect your strategies and affect the tactics and the way that you're going to play the game. That's it. That is simply how the entire player's turn works, and we're going to continue going around the table, every single player taking those 3 actions. Our action phase, choosing one of the 4 actions of movement by picking a land type and moving all of our sages in that land 2 spaces. Everybody else moves their sages in that land type 1 space. It's mandatory. You have to do it. You don't have a choice. The only way to minimize that movement is if you move into a landmark space, you can decide to interact with it if you like at that point. And then we're going to go into oblivion. We're going to continue to do this, keeping up, advancing the time and the chapter markers until we get to the end of the time. Once we reach the end of the time, that's going to be the final round of the game. Then we're going to add up all of the victory points based on our scenario, and we're going to figure out who is going to be the grand winner of the game of Fabled The Spirit Lands. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this video series. If you have any comments or questions, make sure you leave them down in the YouTube comments down below. I will get to them as quickly as I can. You also feel free to email me, off-the-shelf board game reviews. That is otsbgr@gmail.com. I do my best to answer those questions as quickly as I can. If you enjoy the content, you enjoy the videos I put out there, think about supporting the channel on Patreon. Patreon.com/OTSBGR. This channel is 100% sponsor free. That means I don't make you watch commercials, and I'm not beholden to sponsors. My opinions are my own because I'm not having my opinions paid for. But that does mean that all this stuff does come out of my own pocketbook. You can help me cover those costs. $1 in the tip jar, or even you don't need to do that. 2 seconds at a time, click that like button, click that subscribe button, and tell those YouTube analytics that this is a channel that's worth watching. Hope you enjoy this video. I hope you enjoy this video series. And as always, thanks for watching.